Now then, community, how are we? I'm Andy Hall and welcome to episode 4 of Cannopoly Talks. So, there's been a lot of discussion this week, and this topic is covering that. Could the UK legalise cannabis overnight? Not really, but with all the discussion around cannabis reform at the moment, I wanted to look at what would actually happen if it did. People often say, just legalise it, but when I sat down and started listing everything that you would actually need to think about, this just kept on getting bigger, kept on growing. Because changing the law overnight and having a functional legal system overnight are two completely different things. So let's imagine it actually happened. Cannabis became legal today. What happens on day one? Imagine tomorrow morning the announcement comes, the UK has changed its cannabis laws. What happens next? Because the conversation normally stops there. People talk about whether cannabis should be legal, but what happens after legalisation? Who grows it or who doesn't grow it? But who regulates it? What protects people? What happens to patients? What happens to the existing market? You know, everyone wants cannabis legalised, but nobody really talks about what happens after it is. So again, let's imagine it happened today. Let's explore the reality behind the headline, because making a case for the change is not the same as explaining how change will work. You know, someone can have a completely legitimate objective, legalise cannabis. They can campaign, build memberships, raise money, lobby governments, generate public support. That's all fine, but eventually someone has to answer, legalise what exactly? You know, possession, home cultivation, commercial cultivation, retail consumption venues, imports. What about existing illicit producers entering the market? And what about medical cannabis alongside adult use? And then under whose authority? Which standards? Who gets a license? What happens when licenses are getting processed? And then what happens to people already operating outside the law? So what happens on day one? Or perhaps more importantly, how does day one actually happen? You know, a campaign might successfully convince a government, yes, we're all going to legalise cannabis, fantastic, campaign one. Now what? What happens tomorrow? While we discuss this topic, we should also consider something else. believing the law should change doesn't mean the law has already changed. And legalisation doesn't necessarily mean everything that happened under prohibition automatically becomes acceptable within the new legal system. You see, someone might have cultivated cannabis illegally for 20 years and they've developed exceptional knowledge. So if legalisation happens, that knowledge could be enormously valuable. But does 20 years of experience automatically qualify someone to commercially supply a regulated market? Maybe not. Equally though, the opposite perspective deserves its strongest argument, and should a new legal market disregard decades of legacy knowledge simply because it was developed under prohibition? Again, maybe not. So if cannabis becomes legal today, what happens to the people who had already grown it yesterday? Do they stop, continue, apply for a license, get training, meet minimum standards? I've learned through my own experience that believing something should be different doesn't give you permission to act as though the law has already changed. So if the law did change tomorrow, where exactly would we draw the new line? How much of the legacy market should transition into the legal market, and what responsibilities should come with that opportunity? For that, we should think about something else. That's how can the same plant be considered an acceptable medicine for one person, a regulated adult use product for another, and a criminal substance for someone else? Yeah, I mean, the answer, of course, isn't simply that one is safe and another is unsafe, because legal status is not proof of safety, and illegality isn't proof that something has no legitimate use. The differences they can come from multiple areas like jurisdiction, intended use, medical supervision, or product standards, even licensing or evidence thresholds, and political choices. So imagine three people consuming broadly comparable cannabis. Person A is prescribed cannabis in the UK. Person B buys regulated adult cannabis legally in a US state. Um, Person C obtains cannabis from an unregulated source in the UK, perhaps. Now, the plant hasn't magically changed because they crossed the border, but the system surrounding the person has changed enormously. One has clinical oversight and a legal supply chain. One might have a regulated non-medical supply chain, and one has neither. So when we regulate cannabis, are we regulating the plant, or are we regulating the circumstances surrounding its use? Deeper down, it seems to be more about deciding which risks society is prepared to tolerate, which risks it wants to regulate, and which behaviours remain prohibited. So, smoking is a good example. Legalising cannabis wouldn't automatically answer whether smoking should be permitted indoors. We already have legal products whose use is restricted because of risks to other people. So personal autonomy and public protection can coexist. What you choose to consume is one question. Where and how you consume it around others is another. And there's also another argument that maintaining radically different systems can create stigma and unequal treatment. But there's an equally serious counter argument. Medicine and general consumer products often require different standards precisely because the purposes are different. So the question becomes, does cannabis need two completely separate worlds, or could those worlds share more infrastructure, knowledge, and standards while retaining the necessary differences? You know, medical patients deserve clinical oversight and pharmaceutical quality assurance. Adult use regulation serves a different purpose, but perhaps creating completely different worlds around the same plant might duplicate systems, reinforce stigma, and prevent useful knowledge from travelling between them. So, what exactly are we trying to protect people from? Is it the plant itself, contaminated products, problematic use, impaired driving, or secondhand smoke? Is it organised crime, unregulated supply, or maybe youth access? You know, if we don't define the harm we're trying to prevent, it's difficult to judge whether prohibition, medicalisation, decriminalisation, or legal regulation is actually addressing it. Changing the law straight away might theoretically be possible, but could the systems surrounding the law change with it? So let's say the government announces tonight cannabis will be legal from tomorrow. You wake up the next morning. What's the first real world problem you think the UK faces? Do existing illegal dealers suddenly think they're legitimate businesses? Do cannabis clubs assume they can open the doors? Do home growers start selling excess flower? Do police stop enforcing immediately? Will will patients wonder whether they still need a prescription? Do licensed medical companies suddenly face competition from products produced to completely different standards? And do councils get flooded with people wanting to open shops? What's the first scene you see happening? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Is it something to really think about there? So the UK has legalised cannabis. Not really, but let's look at the timeline of events. We already know enough about cannabis to regulate some forms of it legally. So how much more do we genuinely need to know before we can regulate other forms? Maybe we've been asking the wrong question. Perhaps legalising cannabis doesn't require us to choose between freedom and regulation. Perhaps we need to decide where the regulation belongs. My first thought wasn't actually about cannabis. It was, how does a country even make a decision like that? Because surely one person doesn't just wake up and decide. So if I was Prime Minister, who am I calling first? Is it the Home Secretary, the Health Secretary, maybe the police? Actually, would I speak to patients before anyone else? Or businesses? Or, hang on, before all of them, can I even legally do this? And who actually needs to be in the room before a decision like this is made? Well, it's not quite as simple as signing a piece of paper. The UK is part of international drug control agreements. It's got domestic legislation, regulatory systems, and international relationships to consider. So even if the government wanted to change the law, the question isn't just can we, it's also who actually needs to be in the room before a decision like this can even be made. Okay, so who knows the answer to that? Maybe legal advisors, maybe the Home Office, maybe international affairs. And here's another question. Does everybody, does everyone who deserves a seat usually get one? Because who sits around that table could shape the model that eventually emerges. You see, a police-led conversation might look different to a health-led one. A patient-led discussion might prioritise different outcomes to a treasury-led discussion. Businesses may see opportunity, public health may see risk. Communities may see something completely different again. And once all those people are finally in the room, they still have another problem. Even if everyone agrees, how do you actually implement it? Maybe one person believes prohibition still works. Someone else wants a tightly controlled medical model. Another supports regulated adult use. Someone else thinks home cultivation should play a part. Another believes education should come before any legal change. None of these people are necessarily wrong. They're simply bringing different models into the room. So, could the UK legalise cannabis overnight? Let's imagine that after hearing all of those perspectives, one approach begins to emerge. Not because it's perfect, but because it's the one the room decides to test. Liberalise the person, regulate the market, and perhaps one principle sits underneath all. Personal freedom ends where responsibility to other people begins. So the Prime Minister walks out at number 10 the next morning and announces, today the government will be implementing a regulated cannabis framework. But what does implementation actually mean? Right? As they say, the decision has been made, Parliament has voted, the announcement has gone out. But here's the thing, governments don't just change laws, they implement systems. And the more I thought about it, the more I realised there probably isn't one obvious way of doing this. There are several possible futures. And None of them are perfect. Everyone involves trade-offs. So let's imagine how each one might work. Option one, a rapid transition. First option is quite simple: legalise it, put the law in place, then build the system around it as quickly as possible. The arguments for this approach is obvious because it ends prohibition immediately. It starts replacing the illicit market. It creates economic activity, and it stops waiting for the perfect system before taking any action. But the obvious question is, what happens if the market develops faster than the regulations? If licenses aren't ready, if inspections aren't ready, if standards aren't ready, correcting mistakes after thousands of businesses have already operating could become far more difficult than getting it right in the first place. Option two would be build around what already exists. The second approach always says, why start from scratch? The UK already regulates medicines, alcohol, tobacco, food, controlled drugs, businesses, imports, taxation, professional standards. You know, perhaps cannabis doesn't need an entirely new system. Perhaps it borrows from a system we already trust. The advantage is speed and familiarity. The challenge is that cannabis doesn't fit neatly into any one existing framework. So force it into the wrong system and you might solve one problem while creating another. A third option is a controlled transition, and that would be to announce the intention to legalise, but not legalise immediately. Instead, spend the next year or however long it takes building the framework first. Um, Consultation, licensing, training, inspection, standards, education, guidance. Then, you know, once everything is ready, switch on the law. The advantage is obvious. I mean, A1 becomes far less chaotic. The downside, though, people might reasonably ask, if you've already accepted the principle, why are we still waiting? Meanwhile, the existing illicit market continues as exactly as before. So a fourth option is a phased transition. Another possibility is not trying to achieve everything at once. Start small, run pilots, expand medical access, trial different licensing models, learn from each step before we take the next step. And then that's probably the lowest risk approach because every stage generates evidence before the next decision is made. But equally, it could have some painfully slow and small pilots. Don't always tell you what happens when millions of people become part of the system. So we must have a fifth option, and that's infrastructure first. Then I found myself wondering if there was another way of looking at this. What if we've been thinking about it backwards? Instead of asking when should we legalise it, perhaps we should first ask what can we prepare before legalisation ever happens? Because standards don't have to wait. Training doesn't need to wait. Professional guidance doesn't need to wait. Community governance doesn't need to wait. Inspection models don't need to wait. competency frameworks don't need to wait, and education certainly doesn't need to wait. Maybe maybe the law is the final step, not the first one. Maybe legislation shouldn't create the system. Maybe it should activate a system that's already been prepared. And if that's true, perhaps the conversation isn't simply about changing the law. Perhaps it's about building the foundations before the law ever changes. Maybe legalisation is the beginning of the journey. Maybe it's the moment all the preparation finally becomes visible. Makes me wonder, can you build a legal market before it's legal? The answer sounds almost paradoxical. At first, that sounds impossible, but maybe we're thinking about it backwards. The law might not exist yet, but regulatory frameworks can, licensing systems can, standards, training, guidance, education can, all before the law comes into force. Then, on day one, the law activates a system that is already waiting. Now, the real work begins day one. Who's first to realise this changes their day? Who's first person whose phone rings? Who's the first organisation that needs guidance? Who's the first business asking questions? Who's the first patient wondering whether they still need a prescription? Who's the first police officer asking, what do we enforce now? And I actually think there's an even bigger discovery here. You know, we've been talking about, could the UK legalise cannabis overnight? Everyone talks about the day the law changes, but perhaps the more interesting question is, how much should have already changed before that day ever arrives? Because maybe a legal market doesn't begin on day one. It begins long before the law changes. Maybe we've been waiting for the government to prepare the sector, but perhaps the sector should be prepared in itself. You know, at the beginning I said people often say just legalise it. And after spending the last 20 minutes talking this through, I don't think that's the whole question anymore. Maybe the better question is, what can we prepare before legalisation ever happens? Because perhaps a legal market doesn't begin on day one, it begins years before the law changes. You know, standards, communities, governance, education don't have to wait. And if change ever comes, perhaps the people who will be ready won't be the ones who shouted the loudest. They'll be the ones who quietly built the foundations before anyone asked for them, you know? If we stop talking,